Hi everyone, my name is Leanne McCarthy. For those of you who don't know me, I've really enjoyed getting to kind of know you guys through LinkedIn and read your comments and see all the infographics you guys are posting. So it's nice to kind of informally meet you for now until we really meet on Wednesday. But yes, so welcome to the first webinar of our summer course. Today we are going to be discussing Chapter 2 of our textbook, which goes over the definitions, history, and theories of distance education. So I'm just going to have you guys jump right on in with me. So here are the lesson objectives that I have set for this webinar. Upon completion, I hope that you are all able to discuss the multiple definitions surrounding distance education, explain the evolution of distance education through history, and describe the various theories that exist about distance education. Some terms to kind of clear up before we get too far in. I'm actually going to start at the bottom of this list. So distance education is considered the overall and inclusive term. So if we jump now to the top, e-learning, e-training usually refers to distance education in the private sector. Virtual education and virtual schooling are used to refer to distance education in the K through 12 industry. Online learning and online education refers to distance education in higher ed. And again, distance education is kind of that all-inclusive term. The four are kind of used interchangeably, sometimes in error, but this is the breakdown here. Moving forward throughout this webinar, we are going to be sticking with the term distance education, but just know that we're talking about all these different industries. We are going to start off with some of the definitions that surround distance education. So here I have the primary definition, and I put that in quotation marks because there are many out there, but the one that I picked and the one that will kind of explain distance education as it is, referred to in this webinar, we're looking at institution-based formal education where the learning group is separated and where interactive telecommunication systems are used to connect learners, resources, and instructors. So like I said, there are many definitions and of course many ways to explain distance education, but what we're looking for in a proper definition is these four components. So first being institutionally based, which this is how we differentiate distance education from a self-study. The institutions could be colleges, businesses, companies, corporations, etc. Next is the separation of the teacher and student. It can be geographically, time-wise, if you're in an asynchronous course, intellectually, there's that separation, that's what we're trying to bridge that gap. Next is interactive telecommunications. So that can be TV, telephone, internet, postal system, etc. You'll see quite a variety of that as we jump into the history later on in this webinar. It's really fascinating. But just overall, the learners are able to interact with each other, with the resources, and with their instructor. And then we have the learning experiences present. So of course, experiences that promote learning, including resources that are observed, felt, heard, or completed. Here are, kind of a variety of other definitions that exist and kind of how they span over time. I really encourage you and welcome you to pause the webinar here so that you can read all of these definitions in their entirety. I don't want to sit here and read it for all of you guys, but just some things to highlight. For example, the first one that we see on the left, French law 1971, education that either does not imply the physical presence of the teacher appointed to dispense it in the place where it is received, or in which the teacher is present only on occasion or for selected tasks. So that might be different from how some of you perceive distance education because it highlights that the teacher is present only on occasion, but the teacher still has that presence. Another one I want to point out is, so all the way on the right to the bottom with the blue bracket, the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Educational Research and Improvement in 2006, the application of telecommunications and electronic devices which enable students and learners to receive instruction that originates from some distant location. This one kind of really hones in and pinpoints that it's telecommunication and electronic devices, which you'll see hasn't always been the case. But again, please, if you'd like to pause here so you can read, quite a variety of definitions that exist. According to Desmond Keegan, there are actually 5 main elements of definitions of distance education in his opinion. So if we take a look, the first one is that separation of teacher and learner. Next is the educational organization. Third, and this one I actually really appreciate, he says is the use of technical media, which includes print, audio, video, computer, etc. So he doesn't necessarily pinpoint it down to electronic devices, which I liked. Next is that two-way communication. And then lastly, he says the quasi-permanent absence of the learning group throughout the length of the learning process so that people are usually taught as individuals and not in groups, with the occasional possibility of meetings. So when we think about a traditional classroom, everyone is present in the same room, you're always in that group. But when you're distance learning, usually you're by yourself, like I am right now, like you are, behind your computer. So you're not always together in a group. So I thought that was kind of an interesting point that he added on here. So when you look at why, the reason for so many different definitions, I think it mostly has to do with the fact that distance education, and you'll see this really when we get into the history portion of this webinar, it's just evolved so much. It's rapidly changing. There's so many different media that we can use. And so for that reason, these definitions have to be always evolving and kind of open to all these different ways and methods that we can participate in distance education. Okay, we've come to our first learner engagement. So I have created a Padlet, and you will see the link to the Padlet in the same place you found the link to this video. The Padlet is going to serve as our method of two-way communication. So even though this is an asynchronous webinar, we still have the ability to communicate with each other. I've created 3 learner engagement prompts, so you can choose one, you feel strongly about, or all 3, and you can post your thoughts on the Padlet, and then everyone has the ability to comment and like and really create a conversation going there. So I'm looking forward to it and to seeing what you guys have to say. The first prompt we have here is, which definition do you think best captures distance education? Or how would you phrase your own definition? So I'm excited and I'm looking forward to your comments. The next piece we're going to take a look at is the history of distance education and kind of how it evolved over time. So it first started about 187 years ago in a Swedish newspaper. There was an advertisement posted in 1833 and offered the opportunity to study composition through the medium of the post. So from my understanding, they would write letters back and forth, the learners and the instructors, and they created the first distance education media that way. And then not too long after, an English newspaper offered shorthand instruction via correspondence. And that same gentleman, Isaac Pitman, 3 years later, instruction was formalized with the founding of his Phonographic Correspondence Society, which was the precursor to Sir Isaac Pitman's correspondence colleges. So, even in the 1800s, we're seeing this great need and success for distance learning, which I thought was really interesting. So it didn't take long for this idea of distance education to catch on and start spreading across the globe. So here's a couple of other examples. Charles and Gustav, and I apologize because I know I butchered their last names, but Charles and Gustav started teaching language in Berlin in 1873. Anna Elliott Tickner started teaching classical curriculum in Boston, and this one was pretty interesting. She taught to mostly women, so even in the 1800s, they saw this ability for women to have education in the home, which is amazing. So learners corresponded monthly with their instructors, and they were given guided readings and frequent tests. In 1883 through 1891, William Rainey Harper led the program when academic degrees via correspondence were authorized in New York. So here's a little quote from him regarding the learner when it comes to distance education. So he says, "The student who has prepared a certain number of lessons in the correspondence school knows more of the subject treated in those lessons and knows it better than the student who has covered the same ground in the classroom." So they're really starting to see just the great success that distance education offers. And then, as we know, technology is always evolving. So, with the growth of technology, we see new media available for distance education. So, a couple of examples: audio recordings were started to be used, so that offered a great benefit for visually impaired learners and also those taking language courses so they can hear that. Lab kits could be sent to students learning engineering and electronics so they could kind of tinker at home with those kits. College credit courses were offered via broadcast television. This I thought was pretty interesting. In 1980, the first state educational satellite system, it's called Learn Alaska, was created, and it offered 6 hours of instructional TV every day to 100 villages, some so secluded they were only accessible by air. So in the late 1900s, we're seeing those who previously, may not have had the ability to learn so many of these things that are being offered in these areas that are just that secluded, now have 6 hours of instruction every single day. So it's really incredible. And then other tech, of course, was developed. So we see fiber optic communication, live two-way high quality audio and video systems. So it's just really growing at such a fast pace and really evolving. So we start to see emerging universities. So in the late 1900s, here's a couple examples. We see the University of South Africa becomes a distance teaching university, entirely distance teaching. So this really shook up the way that distance education was regarded, seeing, an entire university taking hold of this idea. In 1971, so not too far after that, the Open University of the United Kingdom was founded, and that became a landmark because it just brought this degree of prestige to distance education. So a lot of people are really seeing this and catching sight of it, which just prompts it to grow even further. So a couple of reasons why we see this change happening and this desire for distance education. So first, the overall desire to increase educational offerings. Next, many potential students are adults who, like many of us in this class, have prior commitments like jobs, families, social commitments, etc. So distance learning or distance education opens up the opportunity to these types of students. Providing education to disadvantaged groups benefits both the individual and the society. Jobs require continued learning and increased training, the desire to support educational innovation, and the increased economical use of educational resources. So, of course, I'm sure we could all list so many reasons why, this idea of distance education is so beneficial and why, we're seeing all these changes and all these things happening in this industry. So that brings us to learner engagement number 2. So the next prompt that you guys can answer is, what part of history of distance education did you find most interesting? Or where do you see this continuing evolution taking us in the future? I would be really interested to see what you guys have to say, so I'm looking forward to it. And the last piece we're going to look at are the different theories that exist surrounding distance education. The first is the theory of independent study, and that was brought about by Charles Wettermeyer or possibly Bettermeyer. But his idea is the essence of distance education is the independence of the student. That was his main focus. Most important piece is that learner freedom. He actually prefers the term independent study as opposed to distance education when we're talking about the college sector. So he outlines 6 characteristics of his idea of independent study systems. So first is the student and teacher are separated. The normal processes of teaching and learning are carried out in writing or through some other medium. Teaching is individualized. Learning takes place through the student's activity. Learning is made convenient for the student in his or her own environment, and the learner takes responsibility for the pace of his or her own progress with the freedom to start and stop at any time. So for him, distance education is really, really focusing on the learner, on the individual, on their circumstances, on their time constraints, etc. So that's the main component for him. Michael Moore then has the idea, the theory of independent study and the theory of transactional distance, which in some ways is related to the theory we just discussed. So for him, the transactional distance describes the fullest range of all possible degrees of structure, dialogue, and autonomy. So structure is regarding how flexible the program is and is to the needs of the individual learner. Some programs might be very rigid, while some are really responsive to those needs. Dialogue, so the range of ability for that two-way communication. And then learner autonomy. So for the autonomous learner, the instructor should act as more of a respondent rather than a director. So if we compare that to a traditional classroom, where the teacher may be giving a lecture or really navigating the classroom and controlling the classroom, and the learners are there, they're passive, they're taking the information and they're doing what they're told. For Michael Moore, the learner should have that autonomy, where the learner is the director and that instructor should be the respondent. So in his idea, there are 3 questions that we can look at to evaluate the success of distance education programs. So the first is a question regarding the autonomy in setting objectives. So is the selection of learning objectives in the program the responsibility of the learner or of the teacher? Next, looking at the autonomy in methods of study, is the selection and use of resource persons, of bodies and other media, the decision of the teacher or of the learner? And then lastly, the autonomy and evaluation are the decisions about the method of evaluation and criteria to be used made by the learner or of the teacher. So when we're designing and when we're evaluating distance education to Michael Moore, these are the things that we should really be focusing on. This one was kind of interesting to me. So the theory of industrialization of teaching by Otto Peters, he had kind of a unique view compared to the other two. So for him, we should be, excuse me, taking into consideration all degrees of industrial structures for it to be successful distance education. Um, so when we look at a traditional classroom, he viewed that as the pre-industrial form of education. But now that we've had this industrial era, we should be taking exactly those things into consideration. So on the next slide, I have some examples. In the book, you'll find many, many, many more examples, but I picked 6 here that kind of, to me, outlined his ideas. So you see these terms on the left, and then I have their industrialization definition, and then how they relate to distance education for Otto Peters. So some things that he emphasizes that designers take into consideration is, first of all, the assembly line. So in the industrialization era, workers each do a piece to contribute to the whole. So in distance education, instructional materials, have each of these pieces of assembly. So designing, printing, storing, distributing, grading, they should be done by specialists, and we should have kind of an assembly line setup. Mass production is the production of goods in large quantities. So in distance education, we have the ability to mass produce. We can accommodate much, much more, student body wise than we are able to in a traditional classroom. So for him, something that we should consider is allowing our distance education courses to be accessed by the masses. Standardization. So manufacturers focus on one style of product. So, you have a clothes store, you have a food store, you have an electronics store. So in distance education, we should focus on a standardization. So the academic content, the correspondence, the organization in distance learning should be standardized. The concentration and centralization. So this has concerns with companies that monopolize. There's that concentration of capital and centralization of management. So if we consider that in distance education, distance education does have the tendency to serve massive populations, but perhaps at the cost of companies growing too large and monopolizing and having that concentration of capital and centralization, etc. So something to consider, it may be more beneficial to have smaller institutions rather than few large ones, as we see, is a benefit in the industrialization sector as well. Mechanization, so the addition of machines to a process, of course, we see that in distance education. It would be nearly impossible without machines, especially in today's day and time. formalization is the predetermined phases of a manufacturing process. So manufacturers have, this set up formalized process. So we should as well in distance education. All points of the cycle should be predetermined: the student, establishment, academics, etc. So for auto peters, we should to create proper distance education, we should really be considering all parts of industrialization. So to kind of stray away from, the industrial and factory type way to look at distance education, Holmberg has his theory of interaction and communication. So for him, he prefers the term guided didactic conversation for distance education. In his theory, he associates teaching success with the degree of feeling of belonging and cooperation, along with actual communication as it relates to questions, answers, arguments, etc. His theory states that distance education will be most successful when the instructor caters to the learner in terms of motivation, enjoyment, individual needs, and fostering a relationship between the learner and the distance institution. So for him, the instructor should engage the learner in activities, discussions, decisions, and there should be a feeling of helpful, personal, two-way communication. So according to this theory, that would be how you achieve successful distance education. And then we have this idea of the equivalency theory, an American theory of distance education. For us as designers, we have to be aware that each learner has such a different environment, and things that are available to them in different situation. Whereas in a traditional classroom, we know that each student has the same desk, the same chair, the same noise level, the same ability to reach the teacher and communicate with them. Everything's standardized because we're all in the same place, in the same environment. But when we transition to distance education, all of that can change. Everyone's in a different situation. So it should not, according to this theory, not be up to the learner to compensate for differences to make sure they get the equal learning experience. It should be entirely up to the designer to build distance learning course such that all learners receive equivalent learning experience. And a note here is that equivalent does not mean identical. If you gave everyone the exact same identical experiences and opportunities, it might not equal an equivalent value. For example, let's just say one of your learners is hard of hearing. You can't give them the same thing as someone who has proper hearing because that wouldn't lend to an equivalent value. So it shouldn't be identical, but it should be equivalent. So just something to consider as designers of distance education. And lastly, we're going to talk about not necessarily a theory, but a theoretical debate. Fordism, neo-Fordism, and post-Fordism refer to ways to conceptualize the production of distance education. So we're talking about how we're producing it, how much we're producing it, etc. So the idea comes from Ford, when he created his cars in mass production, that was such a different way of production than we were previously used to. And so before getting into too much, I'm just going to jump to the next slide. For the Fordism side of the debate, those who agree with this side, they would prefer mass production of distance education, because if you're focusing on the product and you're really producing more and more and more, we're able to reach more and more and more students, which is really incredible. If you come from kind of a business mind, you'll also be able to understand that that would cut costs for us. So we could, theoretically create distance education that caters towards, tens of thousands of students. And to that point, if we take a look at this idea by Wheatley and Greer, instructors can handle larger volumes of students through distance education. Thus, universities can reduce the cost of employing more faculty while still increasing the number of those paying tuition. So that's an idea. If you are of the business mind, you would see Fordism as this really great opportunity. Some downsides is that it does offer less flexibility. If you have a class of 10,000 students, you aren't catering towards the individuals much. Also, we see the de-skilled role of a teacher. So just like how we were talking a couple slides back about the assembly line, if we think about that in this sense, we have different roles. So designer, developer, facilitator, evaluator, communicator, etc. when we're mass producing, if everyone works on the assembly line, we can get these incredible designers, incredible evaluators, incredible communicators, each doing their piece. And so each piece is going to be so strong, as opposed to a traditional teacher who has to do all of that. They're not going to be, the best designer, because they have to serve as a designer, developer, facilitator, evaluator, communicator. Um, so if we have this division of labor, we can really create great product because everyone's specialized, but then we're de-skilling the role of a teacher, because instead of being someone who does the all-encompassing role, they're now only an evaluator, for example, or only a facilitator. So that's another idea. And then we see, if we really move forward with Fordism, we see the courses potentially deviating from the traditional definition of distance education. So if you've heard of MOOCs, they're massive open online courses, which is what it stands for. Um, and these are courses that are available online. They're really great. They can, have hundreds of thousands of learners, but you're not having that two-way communication with your instructor. It's someone who logs on, you take this course online, and you kind of learn on your own. So some people argue that's not traditional distance education, if we're going by the definition. So we might see with this mass production less of that traditional definition of distance learning. On the very opposite end of this debate, we see neo-Fordism, and proponents of this side of the debate would opt for focusing on the consumer as opposed to focusing on the product. So they argue we should have fewer courses available, but which offer much more flexibility. So we're not reaching 100,000 students in a class. We're having smaller classes that are individualized. So the benefits here is that we're increasing the variety and specificity of the courses. We're really catering towards the needs and goals of the learner, but at the cost of having less volume of courses and a much smaller audience. So this idea by Hodkinson says that we're going to have a much higher demand on the instructor. So like we just said, if we have this assembly line, each person can be really great at what they do. But in Neo-Fordism, the opposite is that we need one person who's really great at everything and at all. So they say the future of the workforce will demand high levels of education to allow for adaptability to ever-changing opportunities. Instructors without that ability will find it increasingly difficult to secure employment. So even kind of how we're experiencing right now in the pandemic, everything just instantly changed to distance learning. And so for instructors who maybe aren't tech savvy and maybe don't know how to develop and design on, these online electronic mediums, we might see their job might not be as secure because they can't do it all. So kind of a con to this neo-Fordism approach is that we'll see a need for a super highly educated instructor who can do it all. So just something to consider. So right in the middle, we see post-Fordism, which is kind of the idea right between Fordism and neo-Fordism. And people who support this idea would opt to maintain a division of labor and managerial control. So we're choosing to keep that division of labor to some degree. So that would mean the instructors are not taking part in research, the curriculum development, scholarly inquiry, etc. The instructors are simply instructing, and then we have other people choosing that curriculum, and taking part in these other pieces. But now the instructors can deliver the curriculum and keep it flexible for the learner and still cater toward their needs. So we see a little bit of both. So the way I kind of understand this is when we look at the public school system in America, we see that there's strict curriculum that's already set. The instructor can't choose that. For example, all 10th grade English students will read Romeo and Juliet and 1984. That's set. Instructor can't change that. But the instructor has the ability to maintain that flexibility within their classroom. So they can still, kind of change things up and give a little bit of variety while still maintaining under this set curriculum. So this is, post-Fordism has a little bit of both pieces coming to play. So that brings us to learner engagement number 3. The prompt is, which theory do you resonate most with, or where do you stand on the Fordist debate? So this would be really interesting to discuss, and I welcome you guys to open that conversation. And I really look forward to commenting and engaging with you guys on Padlet. So we can hop on over there. That is all I have for you guys in this webinar. So like I said, the link to the Padlet is in the same post that you found this video. So I'm really looking forward to chatting with you guys and maintaining that communication over there. Bye.